This video is part 2 of the series describing how to use DSD's multi-currency enhancements for Sage 100 for Canadian companies. That is, companies that would have a base currency in Canadian dollars and often have US dollar transactions and balances to record and reconcile. This part describes the basic processing steps within Sage 100, focusing on the differences introduced with the enhancement. In part 1 of the series, the setup functions, we had two basic premises. 1. We have set up Division 10 in both accounts receivable and accounts payable to account for transactions for our US dollar customers and vendors. And 2. When entering exchange rates, it's important to enter the exchange rates using the inverse of how we normally think of rates in Canada. For example, a rate of 1.3 should be entered as 1 divided by 1.3, or 0.7692. In the previous video, we set 3 rates for different dates so that we can demonstrate how the system manages exchange rate differences. The demo has been set up using the year 2020. We've set up a rate of 1.3 for June 1st, a rate of 1.35 for July 1st, and a rate of 1.32 for August 1st. This enhancement determines the rate to be used based on the document date, for example, sales order date, invoice date, cash receipt date, or check date. If there is no rate for that specific date, it uses the closest date prior to that document date. In this video, we are going to process 5 separate types of transactions. Accounts receivable transactions, setting up a sales order, invoicing it, and then processing a cash receipt against it. Accounts payable transactions, where we create an invoice in the accounts payable module and then we'll pay it. We'll do some PO-based transactions, setting up a purchase order, receiving the goods against the purchase order, and then receiving the invoice against the PO. We'll take a look at GL transactions, recording journal entries in US dollars and making some currency or valuation adjustments. And lastly, we will look at some bank rec transactions. Okay, let's get started in the accounts receivable transactions. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to create a sales order for $100, then invoice that sales order. We'll take a look at that invoice in the customer inquiry screen to see how it looks in both Canadian dollars and US dollars. Then we'll process a cash receipt against that invoice. We'll use a different date so that there is a different exchange rate so we can see how the system calculates the gain or loss. And then for curious accountants out there, we'll review the GL posting resulting from that cash receipt. Let's create the sales order. Go into Sales Order Entry. We'll create a new sales order. And let's use the date of June the 2nd, 2020. And select our US dollar customer, 10 Munjal. Notice in the bottom of the screen that the currency code shows USD. That's because we set this customer up with a default entry currency of USD. If you click on the currency button, you'll notice the currency code of USD. If we had enabled Allow Currency Change option when we set up the customer, we would have the option to change the currency code. We don't want to mix currencies within a customer, so we disabled that option. As well, we disabled the option to allow a rate change, so therefore we can only see the exchange rate, we cannot change it. This rate has been determined because our sales order date was June the 2nd, and the system determined that we needed to use the June 1st rate. Before we leave the header page, I'm going to change the tax schedule to be non-tax. This is not really correct, but it will make it easier to demonstrate the exchange gain or loss later on. And in case it's not clear, even though you're billing someone in US dollars, the tax schedule should be based on where you're shipping the product, not the currency that is being billed in. Let's click over to the Lines tab and enter the item code for the office chair. Although the price defaults correctly, I'm going to change the price to be $100 to make it easier to demonstrate the exchange calculations. That's the only item we have. So let's go to the totals page and you'll see that the invoice total is $100 and it shows that the invoice is in US dollars. That's it for the sales order. So let's accept the sales order and close the screen. Now it's time to invoice that sales order. Let's go into Invoice Data Entry and we'll create a new batch. We'll accept the batch screen and then create a new invoice. Use the lookup to select the sales order from the lookup list. Be sure to change the invoice date. The sales order was dated June the 2nd, but let's invoice this on June the 4th. So change the invoice date to June the 4th, 2020. We don't need to do this, but let's click on the currency button and see the exchange rate still makes sense based on our June 4th invoice date. Let's click OK. There's nothing else to change in the header tab, so let's jump over to the Lines tab, and when prompted, click Yes to invoice the complete order. We're not going to make any changes here, so let's jump to the Totals page, and notice that we still have an invoice total of $100, and the currency is still showing US dollars. I think we're done, so let's accept that invoice. Now the invoice form can be modified to print the currency on it, but that's not important for our demo here, so there is no need to print it. Let's close down the invoice data entry screen. Next, let's select the Daily Sales Reports and Update task. Select our batch, and be sure to change the posting date to match your invoice date of June the 4th, 2020. Remember, the exchange rate has already been determined based on the invoice date, not the posting date. Click Print so that the sales journal goes to paperless office, and when prompted, select Yes for the gross profit journal. On the PDF, notice that there will be extra pages from what you're used to. The first page shows the transaction in entry currency, so we should see $100 in all the appropriate spots with the exchange rate noted there as well. The second page is going to show us the same information, but this time in base currency, in our case Canadian dollars. Notice that we have $130, or close to it with the penny difference, since we did use a slightly different rounding exchange rate. If there is tax on any of our invoices, the tax journals will print in entry currency on the next pages, but since we didn't have any tax, there is no tax journal to show you. And finally, on the gross profit journal, the last page, we see the amounts in base currency. When comparing the Canadian dollar revenue with the Canadian dollar cost of sales, that will give us a true Canadian dollar gross profit. That all looks good. So let's close that PDF down, and we will update the sales journal and say yes to the daily transaction register. Notice that the accounting entry in the GL will be in Canadian dollars. We see $130, not $100. Let's close that down, and we will update the daily transaction register. Let's take a look at how the customer looks now. Let's go into Customer Inquiry, and we'll select our customer. Now it's easier to see the data on a maximized screen, so I'm going to maximize it and then go over to the Invoices tab. By default, the invoice will show in US dollars. That's because when we set up this customer, we indicated that we want to see historical currency of US dollars. And that means this is what we'll first see when the customer screen first loads. On the right-hand side, you'll see the drop-down options to change to either base or entry. Entry will show the same as the historical since we set up the customer with US dollars for both. If we change the drop-down to base currency, you'll see the amounts on the screen change to $130 instead of $100. And if you scroll a little bit to the right of the screen, you'll notice that the invoice shows the correct exchange rate was used. It's time to process the cash receipt. Let's go to Cash Receipt Entry, create a new batch, and then a new deposit number. Be sure to change the bank code letter to bank code U. That's our US dollar bank account. Let's change the deposit date to be July 15, 2020. Notice that the currency on the bottom shows USD. And if we click on the currency button, we'll see that the exchange rate is now 74074. which was our original rate for the month of July of 1.35. Let's accept that deposit screen and then enter the customer number of 10 Munjal. We need a check number, so let's make that up 1234. And in the check amount field, let's enter 100 because we got $100 US. We're paying the full invoice for $100. Because I know this is the customer's only invoice, I'm going to click the Auto button so the payment is applied to the invoice outstanding. That's it. Let's accept the deposit and now print the cash receipts journal. Let's give it a moment. And when the PDF displays, notice that we have 3 pages. The first page is the cash receipts journal in entry currency, showing the amount of $100 US. The second page of the PDF is showing the cash receipts journal in base currency, or the $135 Canadian. Just a minute now, but the invoice was only for 130 Canadian dollars. But if you go to the last page, you'll notice the recap journal entry shows that the difference of $5 has been posted to the exchange gain or loss account. The system removed the original $130 from accounts receivable, posted the $135 to the bank account, and the difference to the gain or loss account. And that's exactly what we want to see. So let's close the PDF and click Yes to the update. Then click Yes to print the daily transaction register. And when that PDF displays, you'll notice that we see the same debit and credit entry. Let's close the daily transaction register and click Yes to update it. Let's go back to customer inquiry and we'll see what it looks like after the fact. Let's select our customer. We'll go to the Invoices tab. Then notice that our invoice has a 0 balance, which we know is correct. Let's change the currency displayed by clicking on the drop-down on the right-hand side, and we'll change it from historical to base currency. When you click the invoice line again, you'll notice in the bottom grid that you can see 2 lines: the invoice transaction with the original exchange rate and the payment transaction with a different exchange rate. It may look odd seeing the invoice fully paid when the 2 amounts don't match, but that's how the screen was designed. There is no place on the screen to show the gain or loss. But the key to this is whether you're looking at historical or entry currency, or the base currency in the top grid, the invoice balance shows 0, and that's what's correct. So let's review what we did. We created a sales order for $100, and then we invoiced that sales order. We saw that the revenue and accounts receivable were posted for 130 Canadian. We took a quick look at the customer inquiry screen to see what that looked like. Then we processed a cash receipt on a different date so we could see how the exchange gain or loss was calculated. Then we went to customer inquiry to take a look at the invoice after it was fully paid. Now it's time to process some accounts payable transactions. We're going to create an accounts payable invoice, then take a look at the vendor inquiry screen to see how it looks. Next, we'll process a payment against that invoice, and we'll focus on the gain or loss transaction, and then we will review the entries back in vendor inquiry. So let's go to Accounts Payable Invoice Data Entry. We'll create a new batch number and accept the screen. We'll enter our US dollar vendor, which is 10 Munjal. We have invoice number 1234, dated June the 20th, 2020. The invoice is for $1,000 US. And to make it easier to identify any exchange rate differences, for the purpose of this demo, I'm going to change the tax schedule to non-tax and the tax class to NT. Notice that the currency displays as US dollar on the bottom of the screen, and when we click on the currency button, we can see the currency code and the currency rate. The the rate that we see is our June 1st rate. Similar to what we saw in our test customer, we cannot change the currency code or the currency rate because we disable those options when we set up the vendor. And to reiterate, we generally don't want to mix currencies within a single vendor account. So if we do buy from a vendor in both Canadian dollars and US dollars, then we'd recommend that you set them up as two different vendors. Although the enhancement doesn't require them to be separate, processing payments can be a bit of a nightmare if you buy in US dollars and pay in Canadian dollars, or vice versa. Let's click OK on the currency button and then go to the line screen. Let's select the GL account for supplies and post the full $1,000 to that account. That's it for the invoice. So let's accept the invoice and then click Print to print the invoice register. We'll select our batch, ensure the posting date matches our invoice date, which was June the 20th, 2020. Reminder that the exchange rate was determined based on the invoice date, not the posting date. When the PDF displays, you'll see extra pages from what you're used to. Page 1 will show the invoice register in entry currency, or US dollars. Notice a $1,000 US invoice and the exchange rate that was assigned. On page 2, we see the same information, but this time in base currency or Canadian dollars. So therefore, we're going to see $1,300 or close to it, given that we have a rounded exchange rate. On the last page, we'll see a recap journal entry, which shows that we are posting $1,300 Canadian to accounts payable and to supplies. That looks good. So let's close down the PDF, and we'll click Yes to update the invoice register. Click Yes, and we'll print the daily transaction register. And when the PDF displays, we'll see an entry similar that we saw on the recap. Looks good. So let's close the PDF and click Yes to update the daily transaction register. Let's take a look at the vendor now. Let's go to Vendor Inquiry, and we'll select our vendor. Let's maximize the screen to make it easier to read, and then let's click on the Invoice tab. Similar to the Customer Inquiry screen, we can see that we have the currency options on the side. Historical currency is the default of what we want to see, which matches the entry currency, or US dollars. We see $1,000 for the invoice balance owing. And notice that in the currency column, we do see US dollars. Now, if you click on the currency drop-down button on the side, we can change that to base currency. And now we see the amounts change into $1,300, and the currency column is now showing Canadian dollars. So that looks good. So I think we're done with this for now, so let's close the screen. Next, we need to process a payment. One slight variation in the invoice payment selection process is that we have to select a bank code and currency first. Normally in standard Sage 100, when we click the invoice payment selection task, we get right to the grid where we can select a range of vendors or invoice dates. When Multicurrency is installed, we now have to select the bank code and currency up front before we can select the invoices. The only other difference then is when you print your checks, you will not have a chance to change the bank code because you've already selected that up front. Other than those little nuances, the invoice payment selection process and the check printing and updating processes are pretty much the same as we have with standard Sage 100. For demo purposes here though, I'm going to cancel out of this screen and process my payment as a manual check. The exchange gain or loss calculation happen in either check processing or manual check entry screens. So let's go to manual check and payment entry. We'll create a batch, accept the screen, and then when the next screen loads, we'll change the bank code to bank code U, which is my US dollar bank account. For demo purposes here, I'm going to assign the next check number and then change my check date to be July 30th, 2020. I'll select my vendor 10 Munjal, and you'll notice the currency code on the bottom of the screen is set to US dollars. Let's click on the currency button and we'll see that the system assigned the exchange rate of 0.74074. Alright, let's close the currency screen and we'll go to the line screen. I'll do a quick lookup and I'll find my invoice for $1,000 and I'll select it for payment. Nothing else to do here, so I'll accept the screen. Next, when we print the manual check and payment register, we'll select our batch, ensure that the posting date matches the check date of July the 30th, 2020, and we'll click print. We'll wait a moment or two for the manual check and payment register to appear. And like the other registers that we've been looking at, there will be additional pages. So on the first page, we see the amounts in entry currency. So we see the check amount and the invoice amounts in $1,000 US. And then on the next page, we'll see the same amounts, the same information, but in base currency. So because our rate was 0.74074, or $1.35 as we think of it, we'll see $1,350 for the payment amount. And if we go to the last page, we'll see the recap entry. So we see the original $1,300 coming out of accounts payable, $1,350 being posted to the bank, and then $50 for the exchange difference to go to the gain or loss account. That all looks right, so let's close the PDF, and then we'll click Yes to the update. Let's click Yes to print the daily transaction register. We'll click Print to generate the PDF. And when that displays, we'll see the accounting entry that looked very similar to what we saw on the recap page. So let's close that down and we'll say yes to the update. Let's go back to vendor inquiry and we'll select our vendor to take a look at things now. We'll go to the Invoices tab and we see that the invoice is fully paid with a balance of 0. We initially see the data in historical currency or US dollars. And we'll click on the invoice, and in the bottom grid we'll see that the invoice and the payment transactions. On the right hand side, let's change the currency drop down to show base currency. And now we're looking at information in Canadian dollars converted. The balance is still 0. And if we click on the invoice line in the bottom grid, we notice that the invoice and payment amounts are the same. Now this presentation is a little bit different from what we saw in the customer inquiry screen. It is how the program is designed, so we won't see any exchange gain or loss, but we do see the invoice balance of 0 in the top grid, and that is the desired result. Let's continue on processing a different type of accounts payable transactions. Next, we're going to create a purchase order. We'll receive that purchase order and then receive the invoice for that purchase order with a different exchange rate and see how that gets recorded with the enhancement. So let's go into purchase order entry. Let's create a new PO. We'll set the PO date to be June 10th, 2020. And let's select our US dollar vendor 10 Munjal. Similar to our last sample transaction, we're going to change the tax schedule to be non-tax so that we can eventually see the exchange gain or loss calculation more easily. Notice the currency at the bottom shows USD, and like the other currency transactions that we've been doing, the currency button shows the currency code and the currency rate, but we're not allowed to change them because of the setting that we did in vendor maintenance when we set up the vendor. We disabled the option to allow currency change and allow rate change. Notice that the rate is 0.7692. All right, let's click OK on the currency screen. And now let's go to the line screen. Let's order one of those office chairs. We're ordering only one, and we'll change the unit cost to be $100. That's it for the PO, so let's accept the PO. We won't bother printing the purchase order now, but similar to the other forms, these can be modified to print the currency code on the printed form. Let's assume about a month has passed, and now it's time to receive our purchase order. Let's go into Receipt of Goods. We'll create a new batch, accept the screen, and create a new receipt number. We'll change the receipt date to be July the 20th, 2020. Click the lookup button to find our purchase order. We're not going to enter anything in the invoice number field. For purpose of this demo, we're going to assume that the receipt of goods and receipt of invoice are done in separate steps. Now it's not required, but let's click on the currency button to see what the exchange rate is. Because our receipt date was set as July the 20th, the rate is the rate that we had set for July, which is 0.74074. Let's click OK on the currency button. Now go to the line screen. And when prompted, we want to receive the PO complete. All right, let's go to the totals page. Now, if you want to add landed costs for brokerage or freight or other things like that, you can do that here. In our setup video, we determined that the amounts entered in the landed cost screen would be in entry currency. So any numbers entered in the landed cost button will also be subject to an exchange calculation. For our purpose now, we're not going to add any landed costs though, so we're done with that. Let's accept the receipt. It's time to post. So let's click the print icon. This will launch the daily receipt registers and update task. I will select our batch. And we'll ensure that the posting date matches what we had on our receipt date, which is July the 20th, 2020. Now remember, the exchange rate that was determined was set based on the receipt date, not the posting date. If there were items on back order, we will be prompted to print the back order fill report. The receipt register displays and in PDF format, and we'll see multiple pages again. So we'll see the first page will be the receipt register in entry currency. And we see the $100 item being received and the exchange rate has been displayed for us. The next page we'll see the receipt register, but this time in base currency or Canadian dollars. So we'll see the item being received at $135. This looks good to me, so let's close down the PDF and update the receipt register. We'll click Yes to print the daily transaction register. Now we'll print it. And now we'll see that the accounting entry is posting $135 to inventory and $135 purchases clearing. That looks good. Let's close down that PDF and we will click Yes to the update. Let's assume now that it's taken even longer for the vendor to get the invoice to us. 3 weeks have passed and we now have the invoice. Let's go into Receipt of Invoice. We're going to create a new batch. We'll accept the screen and we'll create a new receipt. We're going to select our purchase order number. We'll enter the invoice number. And this time we have an invoice date of August the 10th, 2020. Let's check out the currency button. We'll notice that because we have an August document date, our exchange rate is now 0.75757576 or 1.32. We'll click OK on the currency button and we'll go to the Lines tab. We'll confirm that we've invoiced the entire PO. Looks good. Let's go to the Totals tab. We're done. All right, so let's click on the Accept button. Now click on the print icon to go to the Daily Receipt Registers and Update task. We will select our batch and change the posting date to match our invoice date of August the 10th. Now, as a reminder, similar to the other posting tasks that we've done, the exchange rate was set based on the invoice date and not the posting date. We'll click Print and we'll see a prompt at the end about a variance register appearing, and that's going to happen because we have a different invoice cost than the receipt of goods cost. All right, when the PDF displays, we have lots of pages. We'll see the receipt register in entry currency for $100 US. Next page, we'll see it in base currency. This time it's going to be $132, which is at our 7575 August exchange rate. Then we'll see the purchase journal with similar rates. And at the very end, we'll see the variance register. Because we received the goods at a rate of 0.74074, and the invoice came in at a rate of 0.7575, that produced a variance. You might not agree that this is a true variance because the per unit cost was still $100, and that wasn't changed. But because the amount of the receipt is different, the enhancement does track this as a variance, and that variance will get posted to the GL as a purchase variance, not as an exchange gain or loss. Let's close down that PDF, and we'll click Yes to the update. We'll click Yes to print the daily transaction register, and Print to generate the PDF. Now, similar to standard Sage, we'll see two different postings. The first one is for the PO receipt of invoice, and then below that we will see the PO variance, which cleans up the amount that was originally posted to the purchases clearing account and the amount that was actually invoiced. So this all looks good, so let's close the daily transaction register PDF and click Yes to the update. Whether the invoice was generated as an accounts payable invoice or part of the PO receipt of invoice process, there is no change to the payment process. Therefore, we're not going to show a demo of the payment of this PO invoice since it's similar enough to the payment of the invoice created in accounts payable. Our next series of transactions will be from the general ledger. When creating GL entries, you have the option of changing the currency of the entry. A really neat option is the ability to change, say, the Canadian dollar value of a GL account with a journal entry, but not affect the US dollar amount of the account. We'll examine more on the hows and whys when you need to do this in the next video series, but for now, we'll just review the different options within the GL, General Journal, or Transaction Journal Entry screens. So let's go to General Ledger, Main, General Journal Entry. We'll create a new batch, accept the screen, select a source, and create a new entry number. Let's date this entry June 30, 2020, and the comment of the entry will be to accrue the New York state taxes for June. All GL entries will default to our base currency, so let's click on the currency button and review these options. You'll see that we have the option to change the currency, so we'll set that to US dollars. Notice the post to FASB 52 is enabled. Keep that in mind for our next video series. The exchange rate was set correctly based on the journal entry date, so no other changes are required to this screen for now. Click OK. Then go to the line screen of the journal entry. We're going to debit the payroll tax account, and we'll credit sales tax payable for New York for $1,000. No other changes, so let's accept this entry, and we'll click Print to access the General Journal task. We'll select our batch, click Print to generate the General Journal in PDF. Now notice on this printout that we have two sets of columns. We have debit and credit columns for the entry currency, US dollars in this case, and also debit and credit columns for the base currency, Canadian dollars for this company. 1,000 US dollars shows up as 1,300 Canadian dollars, which is the correct result. So let's close the PDF and update the General Journal. So that entry was the most logic of all the GL entries in US dollars. Now let's take a look at a new scenario. Let's go back into General Journal Entry and start a new entry. We'll use Source Journal of JE again. We'll get the next journal entry number, and we'll use the July 31st, 2020 date. This time the purpose of our journal entry is to change the Canadian value of our state payroll tax for the New York office. For our purpose, let's say the exchange rate last month was $1.30 for the end of June, and that's what our $1,000 was posted at last month, for a Canadian equivalent of $1,300. But now we need to revalue that account because our liability is actually worth more. The July 31st exchange rate is $1.35. So we need to increase our liability by $50 Canadian. The US amount is still correct, it's still $1,000, but the Canadian amount has now increased to $1,350. So if you click on the currency button, you can see that we have other options. We want to do the journal entry in Canadian dollars, so we'll leave the transaction currency as Canadian dollars. However, we don't want to change the US value of the account. So we're going to disable the Post to FASB 52 file option. Remember back when we set up Multicurrency in the first video, we indicated that our FASB 52 reporting currency was US dollars. So for our purpose, anytime we see FASB 52, we can remind ourselves that this means US dollars for us. So if we leave the transaction currency as Canadian dollars and disable the Post to FASB 52 file, that means that we'll be doing a journal entry in Canadian dollars but not posting anything in US dollars. I realize this may be confusing, but trust me, this process works. We'll be repeating this in the final video series about accounting reconciliations. For now, you may want to pause the video and make some notes to yourself as to how and why we changed the options that we did. Alright, let's move on. Click OK to get out of the currency screen. Now, because this is a temporary revaluation entry, we should probably set a reversing date for our entry of August the 1st, 2020. Let's go to the line screen. We're going to post an entry for $50 to debit the unrealized gain or loss account. It's unrealized because it's only a valuation adjustment. We haven't actually settled the transaction. And then we'll credit the sales tax payable for New York. Let's exempt the entry and then click Print to get to the journal. We'll select our batch and we'll print to PDF. Now, when the PDF displays, notice that the same amount appears in both. But the FASB rate at the top shows 0, indicating that the FASB 52 value will not be affected. We're done with this, so let's close the PDF and click Yes to the update. One more type of GL entry to be done for multicurrency. Let's go back to General Journal Entry. We will create our batch. We'll select the JE source journal, create a new entry number, and set the date for July 31st, 2020 again. Now the purpose of this entry this time is to set up the correct balance in the account in US dollars. So the description is set up correct USD balance for the Irvine sales tax payable. Click on the currency button. So this time the value of the GL account in Canadian dollars is correct, but the FASB 52 value is incorrect. This type of situation often happens when you set up the multi-currency enhancement for the first time, and you need to establish the correct starting position. So we'll change the transaction currency to be USD, but this time, because we actually don't want to change the Canadian value of the account, we're going to select the option for Do Not Post in Base Currency. Let's stop and review what we did. Our intention is that we want to change the US dollar value of the account, but leave the Canadian value in the account untouched. We'll do that by posting a transaction in US dollars, and in order to not affect our Canadian value, we want to select the option Do Not Post in Base Currency. So take a moment to make a note about that. And when you're ready, let's click OK, and then go to the line screen. We're going to debit the unrealized account, although it really doesn't matter what account we use, as long as that account is not one that we plan to reconcile in US dollars. And we'll credit the sales tax payable for Irvine for $2,500. So our purpose here is to set up the value in the liability account for $2,500 US. We'll explain more about reconciling the accounts in the last video in this series, but for now, we're done with this entry, so let's accept it. And then click Print to access the General Journal task. We'll select our batch, and we'll wait for the PDF to appear. Now notice that this entry is in US dollars, but the two columns that normally show the base amounts are 0. And that's because we selected the option to do not post in base currency. That looks like what we wanted, so let's close the PDF and we'll click Yes to the update. It's time for bank transactions. We're going to process two types of bank transactions. Simple transactions that normally go through the bank rec module, for example, service charges. And then we will review how to transfer funds between bank codes that are in different currencies. So let's go to Bank Rec, Main, Reconcile Bank. Now you can do this entry in the Check Deposit Adjustment entry screen as well, but the layout of the screen is more grid or spreadsheet-like, but both screens will give you the same result. I prefer to use the Reconcile Bank screen, so that's where I'm going. I'll select my US dollar bank account, bank code U, then go to the Deposit Adjustment tab, and I'll click Add Deposit Adjustment button. I'll do my entry for June 30, 2020. I need a unique entry number for this day, so I'll use 100. My adjustment type is bank charge, and I'll make that $10. Remember our exchange rates that we set up. The rate for June was $1.30, so we should see $13 in our base amount, so that's right. I want to post this to the GL, so I'll select the Select for GL Posting option, and then enter my account for bank charges, put in a quick comment, and click OK. Since that's the only bank charge I need to enter for now, I'll click the BR Transaction Register button at the bottom, and I'll save my changes when prompted. Now when the register screen appears, let's confirm the bank code is correct. That's bank code U. We'll change our posting date to be June the 30th, 2020. When the PDF displays, you can see the base and the entry columns again. And you can see that I'm debiting bank charges for $10 US or $13 Canadian. And I'm crediting the bank account for the same. That looks good, so I'll close the PDF and click Yes to the update. I'll click Yes to print the daily transaction register, print to generate the PDF. Now we see the entry for $13, and that's the desired result for the GL, so let's close the PDF and click Yes to the update. So the next entry that we want to do is to transfer the money from a Canadian bank account to our US bank account. Since it's rare that our default currency rate will be the same in Sage as what the bank has given us, we'll want to be mindful of the currency rate. Now you may be accustomed to doing bank transfers in the GL in transaction journal entry, but I find that penny or small differences created in exchange rate calculations are harder to control in the GL. So I'm going to do my transfers through the Bank Rec module. So let's go to Bank Rec, Main, Reconcile Bank, and select our main bank account, that's bank code A, so that we can transfer out of the Canadian dollar account. On the Deposit Adjustment tab, I'll click on the Add New Deposit Adjustment, and then on July the 5th, 2020, I'll do a withdrawal of $13,225.95. I'll select to post this to the GL, and I'll use my bank transfer clearing account that I set up. Because this bank code is in Canadian dollars, I don't have the option to set the US dollar amount. Let's click OK. Then we'll click the Bank Rec Transaction Register button. I'll save my work. Let's confirm that the bank code is A at the top. That's correct. And change the posting date to July 5th, 2020. I'll click Print. And when the PDF displays, now notice that the debit and credit are showing as the amount that committed the Canadian dollar account, and there is no reference as to what the US dollar amounts are. Alright, let's close the PDF and click Yes to update it. Then we'll click Yes to print the daily transaction register. Click Print to generate the PDF. The entry looks correct. So we'll close the PDF and click Yes for the update. Okay, that was transferring the amount out of the Canadian account. Now we need to transfer the amount into the US account. Let's go back to Reconcile Bank. We'll select our US bank code U. And on the Deposit Adjustment tab, we'll click on the Add Deposit Adjustment button. And on July the 5th, 2020, we'll do a deposit. The amount is $10,000 US. And in the base currency amount, we're going to change that to be $13,225.95. The amount that shows before we changed it was based on the exchange rate set up in Sage, but we want to actually put in the correct amount according to what the bank took out of our Canadian account. Notice that we actually entered the base or the Canadian amount. We did not enter an exchange rate. So select the option to post to the GL, and we'll select the same GL account as the transfer out, which was bank clearing. We'll do a quick comment about the transfer. Let's click OK, and then we will click on the Bank Rec Transaction Register, save our changes. We'll double check that the bank code is bank code U at the top, and our posting date, we'll change that to July 5, 2020. Let's click Print to generate the PDF, and now we see the amounts that we want. We're crediting the suspense account for $13,225.95 Canadian, or $10,000 US, and we're debiting the US bank account for the same. So that looks good. Let's close the PDF, and we'll click Yes to the update. We'll click Yes to print the daily transaction register. We'll click Print to generate the PDF. When the PDF displays, we see the Canadian dollar postings. They look correct. So let's close the PDF and update it. Although this video is fairly long, it does go through the basic transactions for all quote-unquote normal transactions. AR sales and cash receipts, AP and PO invoices and payments, GL entries, and bank entries and transfers. Be sure to refer to the PDF manuals if you would like to examine other topics not reviewed in this video. The manuals are installed on the server, and you'll find those under the PDF folder under MAS 90. That's it for transaction processing. Please check out our next video in the series for accounting reconciliations to understand more about how to reconcile your specific GL accounts in both US dollars and in Canadian dollars. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions on the content of this video, please reach out to our support team by sending an email to websupport@munjowhite.com.